Hey everybody, in this video I'm going to be showcasing my first game I've ever created on my own in Pygame. So I actually started learning Pygame about 2 weeks ago at the time of this recording, and I spent about a week actually learning the Pygame, reading the documentation, watching YouTube videos, and kind of just tinkering with the module on my own. And I have been working on this game for just under a week. So I'm not completely done with it, but I think it's at a point where I can show it to you guys, and you guys will still get to see the full idea of the game. Alright, so I'm going to show you guys the gameplay first, and then I'm going to showcase some of the code. Just takes a little second for the Pygame to load. Alright, so it pops up, click anything to start. I don't know why, but my buttons don't work too well, but it's basically a dodging game where enemies are spawned off the side of the screen. They can kind of track your locations, and you can shoot little bullets at them. Some of them drop power-ups. That's a health power-up right there. It has its own little particle effects. As you can see, you try to get as the highest score as you can, get some health, but there you go. You lose, and then you get back to this screen, and then you can click and you can play again, right? Alright, so you guys get the idea. Boom, boom, boom. Okay, so hopping right into the code, but before I actually start showcasing my code, I just want to say that I'm a beginner to both coding and Pygame. So for any of the pros out there, you're going to notice some bad practice in my code, but just relax. You know, I did this for fun. I did this to teach myself programming, to get better at it, to feel comfortable, and you know, I think it's cool that I made my own game from scratch, right? Alright. So nonetheless, here is the code. Alright, so I pretty much broke up my file, or my project into a couple files, right? Here's the main file with everything in it, but I basically just pull from different classes that I've made, right? Particles, power up, the player class, button class, blah, blah, blah. Alright, we'll get to that. But just starting it off, you know, the basic Pygame stuff, width and height of the screen, the dimension, the FPS, some colors that I used, the ammo, the number, but hopping more into what I'm actually doing is coming down here. We have at the bottom of the file, we have my main function, which is basically what runs the entire game. I have my actual game loop right here. Okay, so I have pretty much two variables that control the game. I have a game running variable, and then I have a game start variable. Okay, the game running is set true by default way up at the top right here, and the game start is equal to false. So basically the reason why I did that, there might be a better way to do it, but I couldn't really think of another solution. But when I actually had that main screen come up, the click to start, right, I draw that to the screen every single whenever game start is equal to false. So we see, as you see here, I say if game start, all of this drawing that I do here handles the actual game. So right, so I put the player onto the screen, I draw the health bar, I draw the score, I draw all the enemies, draw all the particles, draw all the bullets, draw all the power-ups, right? And then when it's not game start, and then I do the start screen, right? And then if I hit the start screen, as you'll see over in the HUD, that's where I put it. I put the start screen right here. I create a button with one of my button classes. I drew the button to the screen. And then what I did was I saw if the player hit any sort of button, or if they hit their mouse button, then it's going to return true, right? And then if Pygame equals quit, it also quits. And then over here, what I can do is say if start screen, and then I can set game start to true. It'll break out of this part and go into this. Okay, so going back down to the main file, right? Every single time it takes a certain amount of FPS so that the game doesn't run choppy, right? And then I can handle all the different sort of events that are happening, right? So if the game starts, we want to be able to have the players move, and what I do for this is I can call this player move function, and it takes in two parameters. It takes in the player, and it takes in the keys pressed, and basically keys pressed is a list that I get that gets all the keys that are pressed at a certain point, right? So then if you go up to the player move, what you can do is see if they're hitting the A. If the A key is in the keys, then you can move it to the left. If the D is in it, you can move them to the right, right? So then if I go over to the player class, then what you can see is I give them initial velocity in the X direction, initial velocity in the Y direction, and all I got to do is if the player is moving up, I subtract the velocity from the Y value, because as you know, I'll show you real quick. For Pygame, the way it works is you have 0, 0 up at this point right here, and then you have the width by height all the way down here. So if you think about it, as you move up the screen, you're actually decreasing the Y value. Okay, so we can exit out of that. And so what we can see is we can subtract the rect X and Y values depending on what, subtract or add the horizontal and vertical velocities to the X and Y of the rect, and then every single time we draw the player to the screen, we're drawing it to its rect X and rect Y. Alright, so we go back into the main file, we handle how the players move, and then what do we do next? So if the player is not dead, then it goes through this entire game, this entire chunk of code, right? So first we have to handle all the enemies, okay? Now if I go up to the handle enemies function, what we'll see is I have an enemy spawn timer, a number, 2 global variables, right? So what the actual enemy spawn timer is I can go up here, enemy spawn timer equals 1, that's default set by 1, and basically the way it works is every single time this value equals 1, I believe, or equals 0, right, we're going to spawn a new enemy. Okay, so now if we go into the enemy class, what we'll see is we load in the enemy image, we give it a rect, and then how we handle where the enemy spawns is we actually generate a random number, and each one of those numbers corresponds to a side of the screen. So all we have to do is generate a number 1 to 4, and then we can tell where it's going to spawn. So if you think about it, if it spawns on the top, all we have to do is generate a random X value and then put it at a certain Y value above the screen, generate it to the right. All we got to do is generate a random Y value and put it at an X value off the screen, blah, 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 right? So what we can do is after the enemy spawn timer gets to 0, then we're going to call another instance of the enemy class that's going to spawn them, and then what we can do is we can get the player's X and the player's Y value, and what we can do is we can actually calculate the enemy's horizontal and vertical velocities based off of that information, right? So this is actually the first time I've ever used Y equals mx plus b practically, right? I guess it's not really practically, not many people are making games like this, but what you can do is you can actually just find the difference in the X values and difference in the Y values, and then you can set that equal to the velocity in the Y and the velocity of the X. But one problem that I was having was I was doing it and I couldn't see any of the enemies on the screen, and I was so confused why I couldn't see any of the enemies. So what I did was every single time the game loop ran, I printed all the enemies X and Y values as a tuple to the console, and I realized that there were just some big numbers. And what happened was, after I did some more research into it, is you actually have to divide it by the frames per second of the game. Otherwise, the enemies are going to move so fast, right? And if you move them divided by the frames per second, they have a very manageable speed going across the screen. So that's what I did, and it worked perfectly. And then obviously we have that update function where we just update the enemies X and Y by their velocities. So going back into here, we finished the handle enemy, and then also what we did here was after an enemy is spawned, we reset that enemy spawn timer, and we don't want to have it a uniform timer where you know when the next enemy is going to be coming, right? So you want to calculate a random number, and I did it between 30 and another number. But one way that what you can do is to make the game get progressively harder is you can pass in the score as a parameter. And what we can say is every single time, every 10 points the player gets, you can decrease the random int, so then the enemies will be spawning more often, and then you can just update all of the enemies in the enemy list, right? So now that we've handled all the enemies, we're going to want to check for all types of collisions, right? So there's 3 main types of collisions in this game. We're going to have collisions between the enemy and the player, so the player's going to lose health. We have collisions between the bullet that the player shoots and the enemy, so the player's going to get another point. And then we have collisions between the player and any power-ups that the enemy is going to drop, right? So what we did was I created a collision function that basically just takes in 2 parameters. It takes in the first entity and the second entity, and then it checks to see this tiny little algorithm type of thing, and this calculates if the 2 objects have hit each other, and then just returns true if it does. I'm not really going to go too into this. This is very simple. Everything in the game is squares, so the collision between 2 squares is a very simple thing to do, right? So then we can check to see if there's a collision between the player and the enemy, and then we can handle the player-enemy collisions, and then we can check with all the bullets and the enemy, and then we can check with the power-ups and the player. So when we do the player-enemy collision, if we go up here, you can see that what we do is we have the master list with all the enemies that are currently on the screen. We're going to remove one of them, so now that enemy is no longer going to be drawn to the screen. We're going to have the player lose a little bit of health. We're going to have the HUD decrease. We're going to play that explosion sound, and then we're going to create some particles. Okay, and the way the particles work is actually very simple. A lot of people are really intimidated by particles because, I mean, it seems like a really advanced feature to add to your games, but it's so simple. All right, so let's take a look at that particle class. So we go in here, and this is all the code to make it, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to give it some sort of x and y value that we're going to pass into it, which in this case is going to be the x and y value of the enemy or the player. I guess it doesn't matter if they're both colliding. And then we're going to give it a x and y velocity. And this class is for every individual particle you see on the screen. It's not going to be it's not going to be the big cluster. It's just going to be one individual one. And we're just going to generate a random number of these particles. Okay? So what we're going to do is give it an x and y. And we're going to give it the x and y velocities, which is just going to be a random number in that range. And then we're going to give it a lifetime. And the reason why we give it a lifetime is we don't want the particles on the screen forever, right? Even if the particles are stopped being drawn to the screen, our computers are still processing that information, and it's going to slow everything down. So if we give it a certain lifetime, once it gets to a certain number, we can just tell the computer to forget about these things, right? So if we go down here, and then also we give it a random color. So then when we actually draw these to the screen, we can increment the lifetime, and then we can check to see if the lifetime is over a certain number. Then if it's less than that, then what we're going to do is we're going to update its position with their x and y velocities, and then we're going to draw a circle at these new x and y points. Okay? So if we go back in here, what we're going to do is we generated 50 particles for this. Okay, and we generated the enemy rect and .x and rect.y. Okay, now for the bullet enemy collisions, right? What we're going to do is every single time the bullet hits the enemy, we're going to increment the HUD score. We're going to play the explosion sound, and then what we're going to do is we're going to call this power up, right? And we're going to create an instance of that power up class, and we're going to want to see if a power up is going to spawn. Okay, so let's take a look at that power up class. All right, so I have 2 power-ups in this game right now. I have that health cube and I have a speed cube. Okay, and basically how it works is every single time an enemy is killed, the spawn cube function is called, and it generates a number 1 to 5 for health and speed, and to see if one of those cubes is going to be spawned. Right. So the first time, it's going to be generated number 1 through 5, and if it's a health cube, then only the health. If that number is equal to 1, a health cube is spawned, and this is not even called, right? Because it's an else if, and if it returns true, it's just going to break out of this function. So then what we're going to do is we're going to want to put that health cube onto the screen at that x and y value that we've given it, and then we're going to set the type of it equal to speed, so that when we actually loop through that master power up list, we can check to see what type the spawn cube is. Okay. And then if we get a number that's not 1, then it's going to call that chance speed thing. And then if that's a 1, then we're going to do the same thing except with that speed cube. And then we have a master draw cube function that basically just figures out if it's a health or if it's speed, and then it draws that to the screen. And then here's the actual health and speed power ups. So what we're going to do is we don't want to have if the player's already at max health, we're not going to want to give him more health. So what it does is it checks to see if the health length is less than the reset value, which is basically 300, which is the length of the health bar. And if it's less than that, then what you do is you increase it by the health increment. And if we go back into the HUD, basically the way that works is I set an increment. I initialized it with basically whatever the reset length is. So in this case, it's 300. I divided it by 3, so every single time the player gets hit, it loses 100 health, right? Because I can't just divide it by 3, because it'll just progressively get closer and closer to 0, and I never really hit 0. Oh, sorry. Got to go back in to the power up. There it is. And then, so if it is less than that reset value, it's going to increase that health bar length by that increment, and then it's going to add 1 to the player health. Okay. And then for the speed power up, basically it just increments the player's velocity in the X and Y direction by 0.5 all the way up into 15, which is that max speed, and you get to go pretty freaking fast. Anyways, going back out, bullet collision, and then what it does is it calls that power up, and it sees if is it going to spawn a cube, and if it does spawn a cube, then we're going to call. Sorry, I'm going to rewind a little bit. We do this Boolean expression and says if this is happening, right? So if a cube is going to be spawned, then it's going to return true. And then it's going to go into here, and then we're actually going to want to spawn that cube to the window, and then we're going to want to append that power up to the master power ups list. Okay, and then it's going to try to remove the enemy from the screen, remove the bullet from the screen, right? What we know is sometimes the game gets a little finicky and it kills the enemy, and you try to remove it, and like 2 enemies are close to each other, and then you get an error. You get that value error because there's no enemies technically in the list. It's weird, but I just put this try and except block into it, and it works fine. And then we call that particles function again, except I only do it to the range of 10 because I didn't want to have such a big particle effect just for killing an enemy. Okay, going back into it. So now we've handled all the collisions. Okay, and now we're going to check if you die. So check if die. We say if the player's health is less than 0, then we set the ammo equal to 0. And basically, up at the top, we have ammo equals 5, right? And that's how many bullets the player can shoot at one time, and that just prevents people from spamming the arrow keys over and over and over again throughout the entire game, right? So you have to be a little more strategic with your shots. Okay, and also, so then it checks to see if the player's health is less than or equal to 0, sets the ammo equal to 0, it tells the player to die, and then it sets that global dead variable to true. Okay, now if we look at that player.die, what it does is, the way I handled it, was originally I made the player image completely transparent so you couldn't see it, but the only problem was the enemies are still moving in the background, and just because even though the image is transparent, they still collide with it. So what I did was I just took the player and I moved it really far off the screen, so I gave it these 2 X and Y values that are really far off the screen, and I reset the player's velocity in the X and Y direction to 5. So if the player plays again, then actually thinking about it, I'm going to move this down to the player reset. But anyways, so then if we go into the player reset, this is what happens whenever the player dies. It brings them to the game over screen, and they click the screen and they go to play again, right? This is what a function is called from the player class, is it sets the player's health back to 3. It sets its the X and Y back to the middle of the screen. Okay, so the player gets moved back to the middle of the screen from off the screen where the player was, and then it sets the velocity back to its initial values. Anyways, so hopping back over, it checks to see if they die, and then it calls that draw function at the very end of the loop, so you have everything drawn to the screen over and over again. Because as you know, for Pygame, the way it works is every single frame, the screen is redrawn with the updated positions of everything. Okay. So, and then if you go down here, if actually, I'll show you how I made the buttons too. So if I go over to the button class, I actually ripped this code straight, plagiarized this from Tech with Tim, one of his videos. He talked about how to make buttons, and it doesn't work that well, I'm not gonna lie. As you can see when I run it, right? Actually, with these start and final screens are actually just giant buttons that I've made, right? This is a button across the entire screen, and sometimes I gotta spam click this to get it to work, right? But anyways, and I'm gonna die real quick, close out of that. But this is how it works. So you pass in the color that you want the button, the X and Y value that you want the button, the width and height of the button, and then an optional parameter of a text, right? So if you want to put text into it. So you can set you go through all these, you set the color to color, self.x equal to x, so on. And then here's the draw button. So it takes in the window where to draw it for, the font size, and then the outline, which is default given none. So if you want an outline of it, then it goes and it draws a rectangle around the entire button. And then if you give it some sort of text, then what it does is it draws it with I just did Comic Sans and then that font size. And then you render that text onto the screen. If you didn't know, you have to like initialize the fonts, and then you can go and you can initialize it, and you can render that text that you passed in. Give it a boolean, just give it true, and then I made it white, which is this is the triplet for white. It goes 0 to 255, and as you know, white is all the colors, right? So it's max red, max green, max blue, and then you're gonna blit it to the screen at the X and Y that you gave it, and then yes, and then this function right here, it tells if your mouse is over the button. So what it does is it takes in the mouse position as a tuple, right? So it says if the mouse is X position, which is at its the first index or the 0th index, and then if it's greater than the X value of the button, and if it's less than the X plus the width, and then same thing for the Y, and then it returns true, then otherwise it returns false. So then if you come over here, and I can go into the HUD actually, and you can see down at the start screen, right? So I call an instance of that button, and then I make it black at 0, pass in all the parameters, whatever, and I want click anything to start. And I drew it at 0, 0, so it's drawn at the top left corner of the screen and actually goes across the entire width and height of the screen. So the entire front screen is a button. And then I draw that to the window, yes, and then I'd see if the player is clicking or if the mouse button's down, and then if with that position, of the mouse position, which I pass in the main file, it returns true. So that basically says if the player's clicking or pressing a button over it, then return true. Okay, and then the same thing kind of with the game over, except I also reset the player, reset the score, reset the health. Yeah, and then I take all the bullets off the screen. Yeah, that pretty much is it. I want to see if I'm forgetting anything else, but I think that's pretty much my entire program. So if you guys enjoyed this and maybe want a tutorial series on this, and I can do a couple part tutorial, let me know. But anyways, yeah, let me know if you guys think this is pretty cool, and if you want some more content like this in the future. All right, thanks guys.